is Tuesday night. We have the continuation of Dodi Tobin Memorial Tefillah series. And it will be given by Abby Lerner. Yes. And I'll put the I'll put the link in the comments. And starting next week, we hope to be back in Minorat HaMaor, Bezrat Hashem. And we hope to be back in Minorat HaMaor. And I'll put the link for registration in the comments as well. But enjoy this year.
Thank you so much. Okay, Boker Tov, Shavua Tov. It goes without saying, but we'll say it still. Obviously, all our limud, all our learning is b'schut Am Yisrael, Chayalim, Chayalot, Shotrim, all those who are putting themselves in harm's way to help us be able to have a share right now, literally. So please God, they'll come home soon, as well as all those who are missing, all those who are kidnapped. Let us begin by just reminding ourselves what we're doing, because we have a lot of work to do. As you recall, we started last week learning the Sefer Minchat Asher, Kללי המצוות, this Sefer with a series of very, very detailed halachic essays by Hagon, the Posek, Rav Osher Weiss, who is not just a halachic decider, but he's somebody who understands, shall we say, the back end of halacha. And in many ways, that's exactly what the shir is about. It's not just about asking questions, answering them. It's about looking at the working, underpinning the reasoning of halacha, understanding the why. So I did, my first degree is in mathematics. And most classes were not about just the final equation. It's about figuring out why, because knowing the why helps you then figure out and address many other questions. And that's what Rav Osher Weiss is doing here. And in today's essay, which is Siman Hey, essay number 5 from the Sefer, we're going to explore a fascinating topic called Osek b'mitzvah patur min ha-mitzvah. Literally translates as somebody who is involved in a mitzvah is exempt from a different mitzvah. And that's a phrase which comes up a lot in halachic sources. But as Rav Osher Weiss demonstrates, even though we often use terms and we reference terms, and we cite terms, we don't always understand them. We don't always understand the details of what does that actually mean? How does it apply? What are the consequences of that? And when you think about osek b'mitzvah patur min ha-mitzvah, that applies to many, many settings, including our own right now. So I'll give you a very simple example. I could give you 50. Let's give you 2. Example number 1, if somebody is a doctor in a hospital, they're osek b'mitzvah, they're involved in the mitzvah of life-saving. That would imply that they are patur min ha-mitzvah. That means if a mitzvah were to occur in that moment, for example, they need to pray in that moment, and they're involved in life-saving, then they are exempt from that mitzvah. Osek b'mitzvah, patur min ha-mitzvah. Now that's all well and good, and most of us probably would agree with that and probably even know that ahead of time. But does that mean, by the way, that they have to catch up on that prayer? If, for example, they don't pray mincha, they need to do a tefillat tashlumin. They have to basically say an additional prayer as almost payback for what they missed out. Well, that's actually a complicated question. It depends on the logic of osek b'mitzvah, patur min ha-mitzvah. Does it mean that you simply, all those mitzvahs don't apply at all in that moment? Or they're simply pushed aside while you're busy doing a certain mitzvah, and then they come back at you basically when you're less involved doing that mitzvah? Now, that's not just applying to doctors, but many people in Am Yisrael right now are involved in mitzvot. I just yesterday did guard duty, and that was a time when it was mincha. Now, because I had time beforehand to daven mincha, that's what I did. But if my guard duty spanned the entire window of davening mincha, and that requires me to be completely attentive and not do anything else during that window of time, osek b'mitzvah patur min ha-mitzvah, but then would I have to say tefillat tashlumin? Now that's only one consequence. But for example, if you're involved in a mitzvah and you can try and squeeze in the other one, that too is an interesting query which we're going to address. So today's conversation is about the halachic details of the halachic principle of Isaac mitzvah patur min mitzvah. And you should have received 2 handouts. One is a lengthy piece, which looks like this, which is about 20 or so pages of the essay of Simon Hay, and where Rav Asher Weiss goes from topic to topic to try and make sense of the specifics of this principle. The other is a translation of the key Gemara, which he uses to introduce a topic. What I want to do is start with that, make sure we understand at least aspects of that Gemara, and then jump into the essay like we did last week. We're not going to read every single word. We are going to identify the main headings and the main parts of his logic. Obviously, I've gone through things and hopefully be able to learn it through together. Any questions before we start off? Quiet. Okay. So let's begin with the Gemarot. It's a Gemara. Just he speaks it over. He separates it because there's a Gemara, then there's a gap which isn't so interesting to him, and then we go back to it. Into Gemara Masechet Sukkah. I hope you can all see this screen, and some of you may well have this ahead of you. And if you have a Gemara Sukkah nearby you, even better. And this Gemara is, the core sugya of Osek b'mitzvah patur min mitzvah. Just by the way, as a quick aside, when you have a principle like this, there's often 1 or 2 Gemarot which really tease out some of the details, but not always all. And obviously, if you want to understand the principle, you have to go to the Gemarot, look at the commentaries, and identify how they're reading this story or how they're reading this text. So here we have it, Menari Mili. So this is jumping already into the Gemara, but I want to give you the exact citation as we have it in the beginning of the Klalei Mitzvot. Menari Mili. How do we know that one who is performing a mitzvah is exempt from the mitzvah sukkah? As you can see in the English, that's an explanation of the bowl, which is a translation of the text written by Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, which is since been translated, now available on Sefaria. So how do we know that if you're involved in a mitzvah, you're exempt from doing, in this case, the mitzvah of sukkah, because we're here in Masechet Sukkah. Tanu Rabbanan b'shivtecha b'veitecha, perhaps le'osek b'mitzvah. The rabbis deduce from the words of the Shema, that when you're sitting in your house, that means that you have a duty to say the Shema with the exclusion of one who's engaged in the performance of a mitzvah, meaning they read into the words, you have a duty to do this mitzvah when you're available to do this mitzvah, which suggests if you're unavailable and you're doing another mitzvah, then you're not duty-bound to fulfill this mitzvah. And in fact, they go on to say, when you're going on your way, this comes to exclude a groom who is exempt from the mitzvah of saying Shema on his wedding night. Why so? Because we assume he's involved in and concentrating on the mitzvah of mitzvat onah, of bringing physical joy to his wife. And as a result of that, he's exempt from the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema. So far what we've learned from here is that there's a concept of Osep b'mitzvah patur min mitzvah, and the rabbis are pinning it on or deducing it from a biblical verse, the verse from the Shema, say the Shema when you have time, when you're sitting at home, and when you're available and out and about, with the exception of people who are not available, such as, for example, the Chatan. From here they say, patur, a man who marries a virgin, patur is exempt from Kriyat Shema, vet almana, a man who marries a widow is obligated. That's an interesting conversation, but it's not relevant for our purposes. Fundamentally, what they're telling us is, if a person is involved in a certain mitzvah, to which they feel they have to have utmost attention and involvement, then they're exempt from other mitzvot. My mashma, continues the Gemara, what exactly does this mean? What can we learn from here? Amar Rav Huna kederech. Rav Huna said it's like a derech. We talked about v'lech v'derech means kaderech. Ma derech reshut, af kol reshut, la'fukei hay v'mitzvah asuk. It means that you are obliged to do the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema when you're walking by the way, meaning when you're doing something which you're not obliged to be doing. Whereas if you're doing something which you are obliged to be doing a mitzvah, then you're exempt from the Kriyat Shema. Mi lo askinan tekazeh devar mitzvah. Continues the Gemara. Are we not dealing with the one who's walking along the way for a mat of mitzvah? And yet the God requires us to recite the Shema, meaning we're assuming that a person's walking by the way and just passing the time of day. Maybe they're walking by the way and doing a mitzvah, meaning maybe the lesson is even when you are doing a mitzvah, you must stop to say the Shema. Imken lemaka b'shevet v'lechet. Mai b'shivtecha v'lechtecha v'derech v'lechet didachu d'mechayevt ha v'lechet mitzvah pita. So what we have from here is a deduction from the grammar of the words that when it talks about going by the way, it's not that you're involved in something else and that therefore the Torah is telling you even when you're involved in a mitzvah, do another mitzvah. Instead, it's telling you when you're simply doing something reshut, something which is not entirely intertwined with a mitzvah, at that point you're obliged to say the Shema. Whereas if you're asuk b'mitzvah, if you're involved in a mitzvah, then you are patur, then you're exempt. Now, any questions about this Gemara? Obviously, it's a Gemara which has many layers, of which we'll touch on some. But our focus here is the concept of osek b'mitzvah, patur mina mitzvah, which the rabbis introduce, and then they derive from these words of Kriyat Shema, and then they apply it in terms of the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema. But obviously, this then can be applied to all other aspects of mitzvah observance, whereby if you're involved in one mitzvah, you're exempt from other mitzvot. Any thoughts, questions, feedback? Yes, no, maybe? Okay. Assuming that's relatively understood, again, we're here to demonstrate that there is a source to this conversation and also to highlight in many ways, we often think that these Talmudic principles are clearly introduced and their details are clearly delineated. I don't think that's the case. What we've proved is there's a concept of osep mitzvah, patur mina mitzvah. We haven't necessarily gone into the details of what that necessarily means. All we know is the case study used by the Gemara to explore osep mitzvah, patur mina mitzvah is Shema, because the source used to derive that principle relates to the Shema. Now continues the Gemara, and again, Rav Asher Weiss then quotes this second bit of Gemara on the same page. I'm going over to the next page. And then it goes on to say, this idea of osek b'mitzvah, patur mina mitzvah, where is it learned from? Now you may well say, 1 second, didn't we just answer that question? Now sometimes we have a Gemara which seems to assume that the source of a principle is one thing, and then others suggest it's another thing. And sometimes we say, no, that proof is better than that, or that proof is better than that. And sometimes we say we need both proofs because they each tell us something significant. That's going to be the conclusion of this Gemara. So the Gemara here asks, what is a source, or seemingly a further source of this concept of osek b'mitzvah, patur mina mitzvah? And here it mentions Pesach Sheni, right? People who are involved in a mitzvah, who weren't able to be involved in the Korban Pesach, they were patur at that moment, and then they have the opportunity to do Pesach Sheni later on. It brings a pasuk, v'yanashim asher tmeim nefesh adam. Otam anashim me'ayu. And then the Gemara then asks, who were these people involved in a mitzvah that they were exempt from or unable to fulfill the mitzvah of Korban Pesach? And we give them another opportunity. It's argued that, according by Rabbi Yosef and Kללי, that these are the people who carried the coffin of Yosef. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Mishael vel-Tzafan hayu, shayu asukim ben-Nadav v'Avihu. These are the sons of Aaron. Rabbi Yitzchak Omer, im nosei arono shel Yosef hayu, v'hayu cholim litaher. If you're going to say that it's the people carrying the coffin of Yosef, surely they would have had time to purify themselves. Then so too. So the Gemara now rejects those suggestions as to who are we talking about that were required to go through this process. Ela oskum met mitzvah. You remember we mentioned the concept of met mitzvah last week. If you come across a dead body and there's nobody else to bury them, you're duty bound to do so, even if you're kohen. And as a result of this, this is what happened. The seventh day after having done so was Erev Pesach, which impeded them from being able to participate in the Korban Pesach. And so the Gemara then suggests on that day they may not have been able to do it, and the next day could have observed it, and you could see this commentary in English, although they would have been purified at nightfall, they've been eligible to partake in the Korban Pesach at the time of the slaughter, and that means that there is a slight weakness in this argument, and the Gemara then concludes by saying that's why we need both these sources. We need the source about the Shema, and we need the source about the Korban Pesach. We need the source about the Shema, we need the source about Korban Pesach, about the fact that if you're involved in a mitzvah and a mitzvah begins, then you're exempt from it. I need to have the source about Shema to tell us that this applies to all mitzvot, not just severe mitzvot such as not participating in the Korban Pesach. Ad kan, so far, this is a Gemara. We're not going to reference much more of this Gemara again, but for Rav Asher Weiss, if we're going to talk about Osip mitzvah, patur mina mitzvah, we can't begin the conversation without being somewhat familiar with this foundational sugya, which gives some hints to what are the specifics of what is this principle. I'm going to close this for a second. Any quick thoughts before we jump into the essay itself? No. Okay. Of course, feel free. What we are going to now do is open the essay. I'm sorry, I'm just going to close this and open the next one. And then we're going to run along. So here goes. Again, hopefully you have this. If not, you can see it. I'm making it a bit larger for those. Can you all see the print? Yeah? Can everyone see the print of the Hebrew essay? Yeah? Yofi. So here, Osip mitzvah patur mina mitzvah. And Rav Asher Weiss begins with these Gemarot that he wants us to be aware of before we jump into the topic. Now, this is what he's really doing. What he's trying to do is explain the Geder HaPtur. What are the boundaries of this exemption? Meaning, what does it mean, Osek b'mitzvah, when you're involved in a mitzvah, patur, you're exempt from a mitzvah. We need to define what patur means in this specific case. And this next paragraph is going to prove incredibly important, and then we're going to reference it to other aspects of what's been going on in the past couple of weeks. Whenever you look at a halachic concept, you need to figure out the foundational boundaries of that concept. Meaning, we can throw around halachic words here, there, and everywhere. We need to understand what they mean. That's the whole purpose of him writing this book. He basically is saying to people who are learned, people often invoke halachic concepts but don't really understand them. So let's try and work them through. And it's somewhat startling to think that the Gemara often uses phrases like Oseh b'mitzvah, patur mina mitzvah, but never fully defines it. And he has to go through a lot of sugyot to try and sharpen our understanding of what exactly is meant by this concept. Him patur mina mitzvah me'en din honest rachmana patre. Now he frames this question in a really important way, and although he later questions whether it needs to be framed this way, for our purpose, let's take some time to understand this. When we say somebody is exempt, does it mean that because they're busy, God recognizes they're honest rachmana patre, God exempts them because they are unable to fulfill the mitzvah? That means you get a pass because you're busy doing something else. Notwithstanding the fact that principally that mitzvah still applies to you. Let's give an example. I made two earlier on. So if a doctor is working in ER and is unable to daven mincha, I mean the whole stretch of time when one is supposed to say mincha, they're working. Does it mean God gives that person a pass that they don't need to say mincha, but technically they have a duty to say mincha, it's just not applying to them. Mikol makom patre rachmana b'fa'al, geshem she'ones rachmana patre, or shema yesh kan p'tur mamash ke'ilu klal ein mechuyav b'mitzvah acheret. Or do we basically say mincha doesn't apply to this person, meaning there is no obligation. Let's phrase this because we're going to get to two important terms. Does it mean that the mitzvah applies to you, but we don't demand it of you? Or does it mean that the mitzvah doesn't apply to you? You see that difference? Meaning, is there an obligation of mincha on me, but I'm just given a pass? Or does that obligation dissipate? It ceases to be. Now, we're now going to get to two important terms. I'm reading from this paragraph, or to phrase it different, he says, does it, when we say a person is exempt, does it mean a hutra? What does hutra mean? That means while they're involved in that mitzvah, they're not obliged in any other mitzvah. Or is it just pushed off? And this is simply a pass to say right now you don't need to do it. Now, I don't want us to proceed further until we define these terms, hutra and dechuya, a little bit more sharply. But before we do that, any questions about things that we've said so far? So far, no. Let me tell you why it's so crucially important for us to be learning svarim like this, and this in particular, and exploring the concepts of hutra and dechuya. So I'm going to turn off the screen just to talk properly, and then we'll return back. Right now, we're in wartime. I think we all know that. And when it comes to pikuach nefesh, of which many of our sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, relatives, friends, and ourselves are involved in, there's a very important question. When, for example, on Shabbat, I am allowed to do something, am I allowed to do it and the mitzvah doesn't apply? Am I allowed to do it, but God doesn't demand a mitzvah on me? So I'll give you a very simple example, especially given the fact that just last week I wrote a series of dinim of Hilchot Shabbat, Matzav Milchama, right? The laws of Shabbat in a state of war. If on Shabbat there's a pikuach nefesh situation and I need to do something, I need to drive a car, yeah? Do the laws of Shabbat apply to me? Well, if it is dechuya, they do, but I'm given a pass. What would that mean? I should strive to keep the laws of Shabbat, but I'm not obliged to keep the laws of Shabbat. If they're hutra, then it's not Shabbat in that moment. I can do anything I want. It's like a Yom Chol. What would be enough nafka? I'll tell you an interesting one in terms of a conversation took place in my yeshuv, which I have a strong view on, but it doesn't matter for now. They were discussing which cars should be placed at certain junctures where if there's a need to drive for the sake of pikuach nefesh, those cars would be available. So one rabbi said they should be electric cars because electric cars are basically involve primarily isurei d'Rabbanan. By the way, it's not such a pashut thing how we define how cars operate, but let's just say for the sake of this conversation. So they said, let's have an electric car because an electric car seemingly is a lesser prohibition. Now, by the way, that would be an interesting concept if we hasken that in cases of pikuach nefesh, things are tchuya. Hilchot Shabbat is pushed away, but still we have certain obligations toward Shabbat. And so if I can minimize a prohibition, then that would be certainly understandable. If Hilchot Shabbat is hutra, then it makes zero difference. Then get whatever car is the best car at that moment in time. Because in that moment, it's like a Yom Chol. They may say, well, that's a minor thing. Actually, that's a massive question. Every community, every yeshuv, right, deals with questions of Hilchot Shabbat and Hilchot many other things, especially b'matzav milchama. And there's a machloket within halacha, whether in dinei pikuach nefesh, whether Shabbat is hutra or d'chuya. And the consequences of that are major. If you've worked as a paramedic, if you've worked as a doctor, then you've probably received different guidance based on different people's conceptions on this question. Now, we're not going to get too much more into the case of Hilchot Shabbat and Milchama and Pikuach Nefesh. Those who are interested, feel free to read people like Robert Emma Cohen's Tshuvot, specifically on Pikuach Nefesh, where he has a good analysis of this. And those who are interested, I'm just plug it right now. This week I'm starting a 4-part course titled Overlooked Considerations in Psak Halacha, where some of these topics we're going to be touching on in detail. However, in terms of Oset b'mitzvah patu min mitzvah, the same question applies. If I'm involved in a mitzvah, I'm exempt from another mitzvah. Does it mean it doesn't apply to me at all? Or does it mean it applies to me, but I'm given a pass? L'may nafka mina. What is the halachic consequence of that? If, for example, I need to do tefillat tashlumin, if in terms of, for example, prayer, if it's d'chuya, the mitzvah of, let's say, praying mincha may not apply to me now, but it still applies to me. So I have to play catch up at some point. If it's hutra, then mincha kind of was erased off Johnny's obligation list. It didn't exist because you're involved in a mitzvah, you're exempt from another mitzvah. Any thoughts on this matter? This is really important halachic terms. Just by the way,
morning.
I just want just before you ask a question, and perhaps you'd rather do it privately, perhaps you'd rather do it publicly. It doesn't matter for me. Can you either in chat, again, you can write a private message. You don't have to. Can you let me know if the phrases hutra and d'chuya are familiar to you or not? Just like
Not familiar, no. Never heard of it.
Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you for the shiur. It's so great.
Thank you, Ellen.
I feel like I knew it forever, but I didn't know it 5 minutes ago.
That's just what happened. That's what learning happened. So if you are familiar with it,
just come, please let me say that we said the Shema in the gas chambers, and like I know it relates, but I don't know how.
Well, perhaps we can speak about the Shema a little bit later on. There's been some very powerful stories about the Shema. But in terms of this concept, I'm getting a couple of messages, of which the handful I've received, majority is no. Now, by the way, I want to make it clear, one of the reasons we're learning this is not to just for you to print out reams of paper of rabbinic Hebrew. It's for us to explore these fundamentals of halachic reasoning, which are part of the back end of halachic reasoning, which all too often are overlooked when people want to deal with halacha l'maisa. But if you don't know them, you can't deal with halacha l'maisa, because there is a huge nafka mina about questions like this. So in terms of Shabbat, in terms of doing mitzvot, etc., etc. So hutra and d'chuya are incredibly important terms, which I believe if a person has been given a meaningful halachic education, certainly needed to have featured, and if not, well, we're doing it now. So thank you to all those who fed back. Just for you to know in terms of, everyone can see. So of the 5 that received, 4 out of 5 said no. I'm not going to make any comment about Jewish education. Let's go back to our learning. So what Rav Asher Weiss basically says, maybe, and I want to make it clear, maybe what we are seeing here, well, maybe we can construct an understanding of Osek b'mitzvah, patu min mitzvah, within the framework of hutra or d'chuya. And that's the question. Is a patura hutra? Is a patura a d'chuya? And he goes on and he initially says, perhaps these terms are helpful. He says, if you look at the commentaries on that Gemara that we just learned, it would suggest that some Rishonim adopt a hutra position, and it would suggest that some Rishonim adopt a d'chuya position. Now, I'm not going to get too involved in this, not because it's not interesting in terms of Jewish reasoning, but because he then says, though that may be so, I'm not so sure whether that's exactly what they're debating. He says, אך באמת אין כל הכרח שנחלקו ראשונים אלא מהות ההלכה זו ביסוד גדרה, ואפשר לא שנחלקו אלא בפרטיה בדקדוקיה. Maybe it's just that these different Rishonim had different understandings of the extent to which one should be obliged in one mitzvah when doing another, but not necessarily whether it's a hutra or duchia framework. The key thing which is mentioned here, again, we could read it, just I'm aware of time, is if you can do the second mitzvah, should you? Or is it if you're involved in one mitzvah, you're completely not obligating the other and you shouldn't whatsoever? So he says some Rishonim say one, some Rishonim say another. Maybe it's a hutra d'chuya debate, but in fact, maybe it's not. And maybe all they're saying is, depends really on the nature of the mitzvah. Now, why am I sharing with you this ultimate rabbit hole that Rav Asher Weiss goes down, which is what he does? He introduces these terms, then he says, I'm not so sure if they apply to this concept, but let's hold that thought for a second. It's precisely because what Rav Asher Weiss is doing here is kind of thinking out loud. We often assume that halachic concepts are so crystal clear. This book is demonstrating the fact that they're not so crystal clear. That when you look through the Rishonim, they themselves don't give absolute definitions. And sometimes we try and force debates into other labels, right, into other conceptions, and we explore and consider, does that help explain what's taking place? He says, I'm not so sure. Instead, as he concludes in this section of the debate, I think actually the debate about osep mitzvah patur mina mitzvah is not so much a hutra d'chuya, although I mentioned that as a consideration. I think, though, there is significant debate about the extent to which one should push oneself about fulfilling one mitzvah when obliged with another, with some being more minimalistic, saying you're not obliged whatsoever to even try and push yourself, and others saying if you can, you should. Let's have a look at the chat. A fair point from the person who just wrote to me, and 100% incorrect. I shouldn't make assumptions. We are now at section bet, okay? Now, having now told us that he's not entirely sure what to understand of the concept of osep mitzvah patur mina mitzvah, he then raises an interesting question touched on by the Chavetz Chaim in his Mishnah Brura and his Shara Tzion commentary. So he's talked about the Rishonim. The Rishonim means the rabbis from basically the time of Rashi till the time of the Shulchan Aruch. And he says, even though many people discuss the concept of osep mitzvah patur mina mitzvah, somebody who's involved in mitzvah is exempt from another, they don't give the fullest definition of how that applies. And our task is to see how they interpret it, to try and make sense of its details. He says, if we look at the Achronim, Neidanu Achronim b'mish osep mitzvah, u'b'odo osek ba kayim mitzvah acheret. If you're doing one mitzvah, and while doing so, you do another mitzvah, im yatsa yedei chovato mitzvah shniya. Do you fulfill the second mitzvah? Now, remember we mentioned that the concepts of hutra and duchia may not apply, but still, let's use them as a framing device. If the second mitzvah doesn't apply to me, then if I do a second mitzvah while I'm doing one, then it's a meaningless act. If the second mitzvah does apply to me, but I'm just given a pass from it, then if I do a second mitzvah when doing one, then I have done something meaningful. He goes on to say, if you argue that you are able to do a second mitzvah while doing one, meaning even if a person's doing guard duty and they daven mincha, a doctor who's helping somebody, they pray. If they do so, have they done a mitzvah? And if they have done a mitzvah, would they be even permitted to say a bracha? If the mitzvah doesn't apply, then you shouldn't be saying a bracha. If the mitzvah does apply, then you could be able to be saying a bracha. According to the Mishnah Brura and his Shara Tzion, he says, if you do a second mitzvah when involved in one, then you have fulfilled your duty, but it's questionable whether it's appropriate to say a bracha. Why is that relevant? Well, that's relevant because we're now going to touch on a topic which some of you may well be familiar with. As you well know, there's a Mishnah in Masechet Kiddushin which informs us that women are exempt from positive time-bound mitzvot, right? Nashim Pturot. And as you're probably aware, there's a machloket whether women who are exempt from a positive time-bound mitzvah can say bracha or not. Most Ashkenazim say yes, and most Sfaradim say no. Now, when we talk about mitzvah tasei shazman grama, that exemption, on what basis does it exist? If it is that a woman is osek b'mitzvah patur min mitzvah, she's involved in other mitzvot, and therefore she's exempt from those mitzvot, then that debate whether women can say bracha and mitzvah tasei shazman grama is already part of the conversation about osek b'mitzvah patur min mitzvah. And however, what's interesting, says Rav Asher Weiss, is the Mishnah Berurah doesn't make reference to this. אפשר דעוסק במצווה גרטפי, ואף אם מי שלא נתחייב לאכול לומר וציוונו, מי שיש סיבה הפותרת אותו, מקיים מצווה גרטפי. So what he's saying is maybe while we may think of the exemption of women of mitzvah tasei shazman grama with a framework of osek b'mitzvah patur min mitzvah, that may not be so. And though there's an argument to be made, and the Ramah Paskins, the women do say bracha on mitzvah tasei shazman grama, it may well be that an argument can't be made about those doing a mitzvah while exempt from another one, while those doing a mitzvah that they're exempt from because they're involved in another one that they shouldn't. And in so doing, what he's arguing here is the exemption of women of mitzvah tasei shazman grama is not equivalent to the exemption of osek b'mitzvah patur min mitzvah. Instead, it's a category unto itself. As he ends here, though, b'tzarach ian. This is a complicated question, which I'm not going to get into entirely right now. Any quick questions before we proceed further?
So, Rav Johnny, I mean, I think I understand where Rav Asher Weiss is coming from with this last part, or the whole diuk there, because it ties into what you said before, that the preceding question is, does it count as a mitzvah at all? Meaning everybody holds that if women do these mitzvot, it counts as a mitzvah, and it should be encouraged, and it's a good thing. So the question seems to be with the bracha more, do we go with our usual principle of we're worried about bracha levatala and we err on the side of caution, or do we go with the idea that since you are doing a kiyum mitzvah, you say the mitzvah, you can say the bracha as well, even if you're, but that doesn't seem to, that it ties into what you were discussing, but I can understand why it wouldn't be definitive on that.
Right. I mean, the key point here is, firstly, I appreciate how you've explained that, but and here Rav Asher Weiss is saying you may think that these equivalent concepts, they're not quite. How do I know that? Because when the Mishnah Berurah is discussing also mitzvah patur min mitzvah, he doesn't discuss the Torah of women of mitzvah tasei shazman grama precisely for the reason you said, because there everyone agrees that there is something inherently good in that act. Whereas also mitzvah patur min mitzvah, an argument can be made, if you're involved in one mitzvah, you shouldn't be doing the other one. And actually, he quotes Ritva on a previous page. If you do it, you're doing something wrong. So they're not the same sugyas, which kind of means, by the way, if somebody explaining the sugya of the Torah of women of mitzvah tasei shazman grama within the framework of also mitzvah patur min mitzvah, they're taking two concepts which may sound similar, but they're equating the two incorrectly, because there are consequences of one that don't apply to the other, which is why this form of, I wouldn't quite call it lomdus, because it's lomdus with a application. Rav Asher Weiss is a posek, but it's lomdus with application is so crucial. You need to understand the why in order to know the what. And if we don't understand the why, then we leap to all sorts of different conclusions. Now, let's, I'm going to move on. Sorry, 1 second. let's move on only because, again, I'm aware of time. Look at section 3. Now, as you've seen in our previous session, each time he introduced a different section, he tries to look at a different sphere of Jewish law to make an argument, right? We're trying to understand Oseh b'mitzvah, Patur min mitzvah. So he initially mentions Kriyat Shema. That's the sugya from Masechet Sukkah. Then he mentions Tefillah, and then he mentions Mitzvah Nashim. And now he's going to talk about something completely different. He says, I suspect, or I seem to think, that this question of the boundaries of Oseh b'mitzvah, Patur min mitzvah, is the basis of the disagreement between the Shach and Taz, who are commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, on the Yordea section of the Shulchan Aruch. Dine b'Yordea ita, the onen patur min tefillah. As we know, when a person loses a close relative, before their relative is buried, they're in a category called onen or aninut. And an onen is exempt from all mitzvot, right? So if anybody have been in the sad situation of mourning a close relative, that window between death and burial, you're called an onen. And there are a whole range of things you're not supposed to do, which ordinarily you would do. Now the question really is, why is an onen patur? Now, in general, by the way, the argument for the Gemara is because an onen is involved in the mitzvah of burying the dead, because the person's passed away, you have to make sure that you have a place to bury them, and etc., etc. Nowadays, in our modern communities, where we have a cheva kadisha, a strong argument could be made that onen is not so patur because other people are dealing with much of that. However, we still believe that still the onen has things to arrange, has things to deal with, so we assume that they are part and parcel of mitzvah of Kvat Hamet, and therefore they are patur. Now here he says as follows: in Shulchan Aruch Yordea Shimim Aleph, ita the onen patur min tefillah. An onen is exempt from tefillah, but eino chayav tashlomim letefilot shebitel ba'aninoto. Not only are they patur, but they don't need to do tefilot tashlomin, extra prayers to pay back, shall we say, the prayers that they missed. What does that tell us? That suggests that an onen is hutra, right? There's no, again, whether those phrases are entirely correct in this whole concept debate, but we'll use it here too. It would suggest that they are hutra. According to Taz, that doesn't just apply to an onen, but everybody's involved in tzarchei tzibur. Not only are you exempt from tefillah and kriyat shema in that moment, but you're exempt from any tefillot tashlumin. Now, just think, what is tzarchei tzibur? Tzarchei tzibur is anybody involved in the needs of the public. Could be charity collectors, could be people involved in chesed projects, especially now. All those people would be considered to be osek b'mitzvah patur min mitzvah, and according to the Taz, not only they patur, they have no duty of tashlumin. Taz, Taz chilek alav katav the din. I think he meant to say vashach chilek alav katav the din osek b'tzarach tzibur kedin honest af patur min mitzvah mikom makom chayav lahashlim. There's a correction that needs to be made here. The Shach disagrees, and he says, yes, when you're involved in tzarchei tzibur, you're exempt in that moment, but there's still some chiyuv on you, and therefore, when you have time, you should say the prayers that you've not been able to do. Can you see? So what he's using here is a debate of onen and the conversations around those involved in tzarchei tzibur to make sense of the concept of osek b'mitzvah patur min mitzvah. והשח בנקודת הכסף שכתב להצדיק את שיטת הראישה, וחילק בין האונס לאכן חייב להשלים, לא עוסק במצווה, פטור גמרי, ומשום כן אינו חייב להשלים, והוא הדין למי שעוסק בצורכי ציבור, שדינו כעוסק במצווה. Okay. Now, even though he says, אך לפי המבואה לכאורה סתר המשתברור את דברי עצמו, שכבר נתבע דנקת איצור, עיקר עוסק במצווה כאונס הוא. Even though the Mishnah Berurah seems to self-contradict himself on a point here, where he notes that a person who is osek b'mitzvah, they're like an anus. And then he seems to follow the Drisha Nashach and says there's no din tashlumim. That's a hard question. So I'll just explain what this little point here. We previously referenced the Mishnah Berurah, and he was talking about osek b'mitzvah, and then we said that he didn't mention women. As a result of that, there's a difference between mitzvah tasei shazman grama and osek b'mitzvah patamina mitzvah. The Mishnah Berurah in one place says the construction of osek b'mitzvah patamina mitzvah is that of anus. You're busy, which we previously interpreted to be tchuya. But then later on, he quotes a Drisha Nashach who says, if you're osek b'mitzvah patamina mitzvah, you don't need to do tashlumin, which suggests that it is like hutra, meaning no obligation of you fell on you. What does that tell us? It tells us there's some confusion about this concept. So even within some of the greatest of halachic masters, there seems to be inconsistencies in making sense of this concept, which is why Rav Asher Weiss is writing this essay. He says we use this phrase the whole time, but we don't always understand it. And even people like the Mishnah Berurah give off sometimes different messages. So summarizing at this point in time, about halfway through the essay, he says, "Mishum ken nir'eh tfei de'en kol hechach dekol ha'sheilot hanal tluot b'hani shnei tzdadim v'nir'eh yoter be'emet en ha'oseh b'mitzvah domeh la'ones klal midach vadai en ha'patur be'etzem sharuhu gavra bar chiyuva." He says, I began with this hutra d'chuya thing, and though I dismissed it, I still was kind of referencing these things. But then I've demonstrated to you that a lot of rabbis seem to be inconsistent in their treatment of osek b'mitzvah patamina mitzvah. And as a result of that, it seems to say that osek b'mitzvah patamina mitzvah is much more situational than we necessarily realize. It's not a blanket Torah. And if you're doing this, you're exempt from everything. Nor is it a blanket obligation. If you're doing this, you're obliged to all these things. It is situational on the level of osek. I'll say that again. What Rav Asher Weiss is basically telling us here is we've been using this phrase as if it's a one-size-fits-all concept. But we see in different halakhic sources that it's applied differently. And that's leading me to the conclusion that osek b'mitzvah patamina mitzvah needs to be evaluated situationally. And so depending on your level of involvement will depend on your level of obligation. Yes, you're exempt, but maybe you're exempt and you're like anus, and maybe you're exempt and you don't need to do tashlumim. And that'll depend on the level of involvement you have in any given mitzvah. I'll pause here for a second, because what you see now is Rav Asher Weiss is kind of starting to say, okay, now we're getting into this thing. Now we realize there's no singular definition of if you're exempt, therefore X. It's if you're exempt, so if you're involved in mitzvah, therefore X. It's if you're involved in mitzvah like this, therefore X. But if you're involved in mitzvah like that, therefore Y. And we see differing responses within halakhic sources to show that there's no one-size-fits-all category. So he basically said the key word, and we're going to see this in a second, the key word is not patur, exempt. That's an interesting question. The key word is osek. Tell me how osek you are, I'll tell you how patur you are. If you're not so osek, I'll tell you are somewhat muchiyav. If you're very osek, then you're much more patur. So,
excuse me, can I ask you a question?
Pleasure.
It's not a question of dechuya or hutra. It can be both. Depending on your level of involvement.
Correct. Now, why is it so interesting to read essays like this? Firstly, again, when we use phrases, we assume we understand what they mean. You start reading an essay like this and you realize, I have no idea what they mean, because I realize they've been applied in many different ways, and my simple thinking that I understood it is based, truth be told, on my ignorance. Point number two, when you survey halakhic sources and you see the usage of a halakhic principle in many variant ways, you can try and force it into a certain mold. That's what Rav Asher Weiss initially did. He says, is it a hutra d'chuya debate? Which, by the way, those phrases are incredibly important in certain aspects of Jewish law. He says, I tried it and it didn't work. Meaning, that's not what the evidence suggests. Then he said, well, maybe it's just about giving people the patur. They're not obligated. He said, well, sometimes the Mishnah Berurah says anus, which suggests it's like tchuya, and sometimes he talks about not needing to tashlumim, which is like putra. And he says, therefore, my conclusion is that it has this duality, that it's a continuum. Osip mitzvah, patamina mitzvah, right? It has a scale, and that scale will have an impact on your level of patur. Now, with that in mind, he's now going to jump into some real case scenarios, which is obviously fascinating for us because he's not just a halakhic reasoner, he's a halakhic thinker. But just before we do that, let's just throw one more curveball. We're not going to get too involved here, but it's an important point. I said the key words are osek and patur. He says, yeah, but there's another word you need to consider, mitzvah. If you're involved in a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, are you exempt from a mitzvah d'Oraita? If you're involved from doing a rabbinic mitzvah, does that exempt you from fulfilling a Torah mitzvah? Let's think about almost all of the mitzvot that we do, not all, but almost all, have some rabbinic expression. I'll give you let's think of an example. You're lighting Hanukkah candles. Hanukkah candles is d'Rabbanan, right? Or you're hearing Megillah, it's d'Rabbanan. Are you exempt from saying Kriyat Shema if you're hearing Megillah? Well, Megillah is d'Rabbanan, Kriyat Shema is d'Oraita. So that surely has a significant impact. Now, he begins by quoting the Aruch LaNer of Yaakov Ettling in his commentary on that Masechet Sukkah, who touches on this question. And he then quotes a Kovet Sheurim of Elchanan Wasserman, who says, who makes an argument that even if you're involved in a rabbinic mitzvah, you're exempt from a Torah mitzvah. Now, he goes through the contours of this discussion. It's wonderful and fascinating. Again, I'm aware of time, so what I'm going to do is skip it, but I do want you to know that that's right there. We now have about 15 minutes left, and so let's talk about some practical questions, which he quotes and which he discusses. Now, do you remember last week I said Rav Asher Weiss not only is a brilliant halachic thinker, but he's prepared sometimes to say that other great rabbis seem to have got it wrong. He doesn't do this with pleasure, meaning he doesn't have so much reference that he can't actually say, I think I just don't get it. In a real Bet Midrash, by the way, you should be able to say, I don't understand this person. Now, a humble person who hasn't learned things should then try and plumb the depths of this. But if you're Rav Asher Weiss and you've understood these sugyas to their depths, you're in a position to say, what is he talking about? So he begins here with a Noid B'Yehuda. Katav Noid B'Yehuda. The tzibur shaya be'emtza kriyat Megillah. Imagine you're in the middle of hearing the Megillah on the night of Purim. And they're then informed that the moon can be seen. Remember, there's a notion of Birkat Levana. And this is the last day in the month you could say Kiddush Levana. And this window where you can see the moon is just there. It's been cloudy for 14 days or less if you're, put it this way, been cloudy for 14 days. Right now, there's the last opportunity to say Kiddush Levana. He writes, Alem lafsik be'emtza Megillah kedei lekadesh et Levana. You should stop saying, hearing the Megillah, going to Birkat Levana, kivan deyesh chashash la'ach hagmar Megillah, shuv lo yeh netan lomar Birkat Levana. Because if you don't see this opportunity, then the moon may well be invisible, not be able to be seen, I won't say invisible, and you won't be able to do this mitzvah. Now he says, Moadi timhati, he said, I don't understand the Noid B'Yehuda. He said, how when the Noid B'Yehuda could say this, and why didn't he invoke the concept of Isep mitzvah patam in a mitzvah? What is his critique? He says, not only do I not understand the psak of the Noid B'Yehuda, I certainly don't understand why in his reasoning he doesn't mention this concept of Osek b'mitzvah, patur min mitzvah. And then he lists a bunch of authorities who make it very clear that surely the whole consideration here should be pivoting around this concept. But from this Noda B'Yehuda that doesn't make any sense, Rav Asher Weiss derives a principle. What do we mean by osek? He says reading something is important, but generally we don't say reading or saying things, prayers, is osek. That's not enough osek to pater you from a mitzvah. It says, it may, presuming that I believe, he says, I can't fully understand the Noda B'Yehuda. Other people critiqued him for not mentioning this principle. But assuming the Noda B'Yehuda is correct here, then he's teaching us a lesson himself, which is there are certain things we do which are not defined as being osek. For example, when we're saying things, right? When we're hearing things, that's not properly osek. And because that's not properly osek, you're not patur from the levana, and therefore you have to go outside and say birkat levana. In contrast, when a person is doing other things, actively doing, then that level of osek would create a situation of patur. So remember I mentioned to you, osek b'mitzvah patur min mitzvah. We first focused initially on patur. Then we talked a little bit about mitzvah, whether it's the Rabbanan or the Oraita. Now we're talking about osek. And from this chill of the Noda B'Yehuda, he seems to suggest that maybe reading and speaking is not enough of osek. And then he goes on the next page. He quotes, for example, the Rav Avad Yosef, he brings a whole chord of achronim, meaning a whole list of authorities. According to Rav Avadia, hefsek in a tefillah is not a question of osek mitzvah, because praying itself is not enough osek for you to be exempt from other things. Meaning, if you're involved in a mitzvah, you're exempt from prayer. If you're involved in prayer, you're not necessarily exempt from other mitzvot. You with me? Now, this then is a very interesting question, because then we have to therefore define which mitzvot are we involved with, which then exempt us from others. Do you remember I mentioned it's a certain sense of it's all about situation. And now he goes on to explain further details about what he understands the concept of osek b'mitzvah patur min mitzvah is all about. And he says, "B'sfarat hadavar efshar dinei kvar nitbar sheyesh shtei drachim b'rishonim b'chol geder patur zeh." He says, if you look through the Rishonim, you'll find that when they talk about osek b'mitzvah patur min mitzvah, they mention two things. He says, if you look at the evidence, they either say if you're so physically involved in one mitzvah that it would be a tremendous headache to be involved in the other one, then you're exempt. Meaning the concept here is tircha. Can you see that word there? He says, but ultimately, sorry, it's either basically about tircha, but in addition to that, there's a factor here called ma'aseh. The whole idea of osek is about the deeds. And so if you're involved in doing things, you're exempt from doing other things. If you're involved in saying things, you're not necessarily exempt from doing other things. Having said all this, I want to now just jump a few bits because time is running close to us, and talk about hospitals and talk about other things. So just 1 second, let me just remind myself where he then over the coming pages, he mentions a whole bunch of other principles, all fascinating. Trust me, I read it. It's great, all lovely. Take your time. And he now touches on some
Rabbi,
yes.
If I saw the moon rising, full moon rising on during the Megillah, I would think Hashem pushed the clouds away, and I'm supposed to recognize that. Well, if I were a person who said the prayers like that, I would understand that I should thank God, because he, how long does it take? How many words of the Megillah are you going to miss by saying, oh, thank God?
Right. The whole question there was whether you pause the Megillah. I totally get you. The whole question is, what is God asking me to do in any given moment? That's the whole question here.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So now over here, this is on page Payback. הדברים הנכונים ברורים, וכך כתבת בתשובה לשאלת רופאים. האם חייבים הם במצוות שהם עוסקים ברפואת החולים? The question here now is, let's get to tachlis. If you're a doctor, you work in a hospital, are you obliged in mitzvahs when you're healing patients? ושבתי דוודאי חייב כל אדם לסדר את סדר יומו באופן שיוכל לקיים כל מצוותיו. He says, ideally, a doctor should plan their day, they should fulfill the mitzvahs, meaning, if you can get to an earlier shachri or pray before you go to work, or if you can arrange lunchtime at a time where you can daven mincha, then that's what you should do. Meaning, an exemption only works when you couldn't have done anything about it. Ideally, you should plan your day. וכך גם רופא, אף כאשר עוסק במקרה מסוים של רפואה פטור הוא בשעה זו מכל שאר מצוות, אבל אם הוא בידו חייב הוא להשאיר זמן תפילה וקריאת שמע תפילין בכל שאר מצוות. But then he goes on and he says later on in the essay, we're going to get to it now, well, what happens if you work in the ER? It's all very well and good if you are a general practitioner. But if you're working in the ER, then you may not have that opportunity. And he says, Ein achanama, you're right. In that kind of situation, also a mitzvah, and you couldn't control your time. The question then is, in those brief windows between one person and another, does that mitzvah kind of apply? Or perhaps you're involved in preparing for the next patient necessarily. He talks, by the way, about limud Torah. Is limud Torah osek, or is it like dibur? Remember, we said, if you're just praying, you're not so much osek b'mitzvah, you're exempt. And if you're doing action, how about Talmud Torah? A lot of people who are involved in learning would say, because I'm learning, I'm exempt from other mitzvahs. He says that's kind of true. I don't want to get into that whole sugya. It's a can of worms, especially right now. He says that's kind of true, but don't push me. I'm just scrolling further because I want to get to where he references one furthermore. בגוף השאלה אם רופא חייב במצוות כשהוא עושה בטיפול החולים, כבר כתבתי לאל, he said, I've already said, תיק ההלכה זו דעושה במצווה, פת מן המצווה, אינה אלא במקרה. It's only in a situation. אבל ודאי שאסור לו לאדם לעסוק תדיר במצווה לפטור עצמו מן המצוות. A person shouldn't live in a way they permanently exempt themselves, right? Because that's not how we should live. But then, as I say, he mentions people who work in the miyun, and in such a situation, then for sure they'd be exempt. I want to share one final thing, which is right at the end of, there you go. He talks about cheder miyun, ומה ששאלתי עוד הרופא בחדר מיון, עד לפעמים מחמת הלחץ, אין יכול להתפנות, להתפלל, או לקרוא קריאת שמע. Person working ER, when you don't have that moment, אם בכל זאת, כדאי שיתפלל תפילה קצרה, או יקרא רק חלק מקריאת שמע ערבית. Should they endeavor to try and say a bit of prayer? הנה יש לחלק שאלה זו לשני מצבים שונים. He says, we need to again look at the context, because the whole question is osek. Shani rofeh osek b'atzalat nefashot b'koach nefesh, a doctor who's involved in life-saving, rofeh harasher b'klinika. So a doctor who's sitting in a clinic who has moments between patients. The first, they're exempt. The second, they have obligations. Let's get to the final bit, because the final bit is particularly fascinating. It's where it says Yud Daled. So if anybody printed the things, we're now getting to Yud Daled. בספרי תולדותיו של מרן החפץ חיים, in the book telling the story about the life of the Chavetz Chaim, and it's also referenced in the footnotes to the Chavetz Chaim al Torah and Parsha Re'eh, מסופר שפעם אחת, it is told that once התכנסו גדולי ישראל לאספת חיזוק בענייני השעה. Rabbis came together for an important meeting about chizuk, about the needs of the time. Basically, right now, there have been gatherings of people where people have come together to deal with real life issues. Just last week, I met with my local rabbanim to deal with inyanei hasha'ah, to deal with Hilchot Shabbat, to deal with chizuk of the Keilah. I wouldn't say we're like the Chavetz Chaim, but nevertheless, we're in time in Chama, and that meeting was an important meeting. Rabbeinu Chavetz Chaim nasa dvarav yagia shat mincha. And the Chavetz Chaim delivered what he was saying, and then mincha came along. Mean the time to say mincha. Amad al raglav echad nochachim. One person who's present stood up. V'krava kol gadol be'emtza dvarav she'egia zman mincha. Whilst the Chavetz Chaim is speaking, he says, mincha, v'tzach lipalel, we got to daven. שמע דברים הגיב החפץ חיים ואמר שלא יתכנסו כאן להתפלל מנחה, אלא לעשות בתקנת הדור במקום כמה מומה גדולה. The Chavetz Chaim said, my friend, we're not here to daven mincha. We're here to deal with the needs of the time, right? But when he said that, a whole tumult occurred. Just imagine this. According to Rav Chaim Eiser, Baal Achiezer, Rav Chaim Eiser Guzensky, he gave Amar Sheshnei Tzadim Tzodkim. He said, both you're right. What a great person. החפץ חיים שכל מעשיו וכל כוונתו לשם שמיים, נקט בצדק שהוא פטור ממנחה כשעוסקים בצורכי ציבור. The Chavetz Chaim is right. If we're here and we're sincerely here, sort of a tzorchei tzibur, as we saw, remember that debate between the Taz and the Shach, then you're exempt. You're mamash exempt. It says there in your there. If you're here for your honor and you're not here for the purely for tzorchei tzibur, then you're right. You have to daven mincha. Meaning, all those are not here for l'shem shamayim, go daven mincha, and all those who are here l'shem shamayim, you're patur. He says, I don't I think what the Achiever was referring to was what the Kesef Mishnah, that Rabbi Yosef Karo in his commentary, the Rambam, puts in the name of the Rabbeinu Manoach, that even though the Rambam writes that somebody who's involved in Tzorchei Tzibur is exempt from Kriyat Shema and Tefillah, En ze ela im kavanato l'shem shamayim. He adds, that's only if it's l'shem shamayim. Well, im en kavanato l'shem shamayim chayavu. If not, then you're obliged. Amnu Kesef Mishnah, ik sha'alav, mash katav mo mitzvah acheret, da'af im en kavanato l'shem shamayim aminam bei, also mitzvah patam min mitzvah. He says, I don't know whether that distinction necessarily applies. If you're involved, you're involved. However, your kavanot. But ultimately continues and concludes Rav Asher Weiss, and the Rebbe said, the osek b'tzarchei rabim, ve'en kavanato ela litgadel litkabed v'lo shel shamayim. If you're involved in tzarchei rabim, and it's all about you, be'etzem osek b'tzarchei atzmo, then you're involved in your own things. Ela shatzibur ne'eneh ma'asav k'b'derech hagav. Although the community appreciates what you're doing. Mishum ken, ena patur min ha'mitzvot. Such a person is not patur. Masha en kein ba'osek b'mitzvah mamash. In contrast to somebody who's really involved in the Osek Mitzvah. So what we have here is a really long essay of which we've touched on maybe about a third, understanding the principles of halachic concept of Osek Mitzvah, Patur Min Mitzvah. I know that this kind of material may well give some of you a headache. I recognize that. I know it's intense. I get it. I know I'm reading quite quickly. I understand that. And I hope I've explained things as best I can. But I also know that we need to know this kind of stuff. We need to understand that it's in places like this, we learn the art of halachic reason. Because if we don't know concepts like Hutra and Dechuya, we don't understand the nefka min halacha. We don't appreciate that there are differences, l'shem shemaim, shlo l'shem shemaim. We don't understand that Osek b'mitzvah, patur min mitzvah is not a singular thing, but instead it's a continuum. We don't know that. Then ultimately we will misapply halachic principles, and that could affect ourselves, others, etc., etc. So I hope we've learned a lot in this essay. Obviously, every essay is a masterclass in halachic reason, but also it is a way in which we touch on a whole range of other topics. He crams ideas because he has a huge familiarity of all these ideas and texts. And we've now learned about Einen, we've learned about Tefillah, we've learned about Choson, we've learned about Shem Shemaim, learned about Sukkah, we've learned about medics, etc., etc., etc. All of that within Siman Hey of Minchat Asher K'lali Mitzvahs. So I wish you a great day. Please go. We have Besot Tovot in the coming days. Look after yourselves. Obviously, if you have any questions, you know where to find me. And thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Those of you who are staying to Rabbanit Shani's class, it's the same link, so you can just pause for a little bit and, here I'll actually stop the recording.